Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video, we're going to look at Unit 4 in perfect competition, and more specifically, we're going to look at topic 4.1, which is the introduction to imperfectly competitive markets. So, this unit that we're starting here covers imperfectly competitive markets, right? And so we'll talk about what that is, but essentially they are very, very different than the perfectly competitive markets we were looking at in Unit 3. So, with that in mind, let's go ahead and talk about what an imperfectly competitive market is. So, an imperfect competitive market is a market in which barriers to entry exist. In other words, it's a market where there are things that make it very difficult for a new firm to enter the market. There are things getting in the way. Remember, when we talked about perfect competition, we said there were no barriers to entry. It was very easy to get into this market. But most markets that you encounter on a day to day basis, whether it's fast food or smartphones, these are imperfectly competitive markets. There are barriers to entry, sometimes a lot, sometimes a few, that make it hard for new firms to enter the market. So there are three types of imperfectly competitive markets: there's monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. And we're going to talk about each one of these in this unit. So, a barrier to entry, as I mentioned, is anything that makes it difficult for a potential firm to enter a market. There are barriers, there are things that stop a firm from entering the market. And there are several different types of barriers to entry. I've given you three here, but this is not an exhaustive list. One would be high startup costs. So if it's really expensive for someone to enter a market, there's going to be high startup costs, right? It's going to be very difficult for that firm to enter, right? If it's very expensive to start a company. Second, ownership of resources. In order to make a product, you have to have access to those resources that are important in building your product. And if you can't get those resources, it becomes very difficult. And finally, legal barriers such as patents and other regulations can make it hard for a new firm to enter a market. In fact, I was actually watching very recently a documentary on the creation of Xbox and how when Microsoft was producing the Xbox, they had to go through a series of regulations in order to be able to sell it in various markets around the world. And that would be an example of a legal barrier making it more difficult for Microsoft to enter the console gaming market. So, in imperfect competition, firms are price makers. They get to set their own price. This is the exact opposite of perfect competition, where firms were price takers and had to take the price from the market. But because there's less competition, each firm can set their own price to some degree, and we'll talk about variations on this as we get to the different types of imperfect competition later on in this unit, but they are price makers nonetheless. And so, because imperfectly competitive firms are price makers, they face a downward sloping demand curve. Remember, in perfect competition, there was a horizontal demand curve. Each firm would only sell it at one price, and therefore consumers could only buy it at one price. So, because consumers now have choices, because firms can set their own prices, there is a choice of price among the consumers. And so this is where we get to the law of demand, as we learned in Unit 2, that the higher the price, the less people buy. And so it works just like you learned in Unit 2. And because imperfect competitive firms face a downward sloping demand curve, these firms have to lower their price to sell more output. That's the law of demand. If you want to sell more, you got to come up with a lower price. And this has an implication for marginal revenue. When we were talking about perfect comp, we said that marginal revenue, demand, and price are all the same. But that is no longer true when we get to imperfect competition. Marginal revenue, in fact, is not constant, and it's less than demand and price. To see that, I have a table here for you, and you'll notice in the table you have the price the firm's selling the product for and how much consumers are willing and able to purchase at that price. Total revenue, price times quantity, and the marginal revenue, the change in total revenue. And what you notice here is that in order for the firm to sell more, they have to lower the price. But look what happens when they do. When they lower the price, they lose marginal revenue, right? It actually eventually becomes negative. But also notice that marginal revenue, except in one spot here, is not equal to price. In fact, it is less than price. Remember that price and demand are always the same, right? Because the way we express how much people want to buy is with the price, right? We use the price to express demand. So demand and price are the same value, and they are greater than marginal revenue. Another way to look at this is with a graph. And what you see here is that, yes, there's one spot where they're equal. We saw that here in this row. But after that, not only is marginal revenue less than demand, but that gap gets bigger as the amount of output being produced gets bigger. So marginal revenue is less than demand and price. Why is that? Because in order for the firm to sell more units, it has to lower the price on each unit sold and therefore take a lower marginal revenue. And then finally, let's look at a practice question here. If a firm must lower its price to sell more of a good, which of the following must also be true? So go ahead and pause the video and see what you come up with. So the correct answer here is going to be D. As we learned, its marginal revenue curve would be lower than its demand curve. So that's all for this video on topic 4.1. Until next time, have a great day.